Hi there, everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of God Talks. Very excited. We're kicking off a new series today called The Way I See It. So the basic idea or principle of this series is just I want to better equip you and myself to read our Bible and to understand it, to better understand how to interpret Scripture and make it relevant for us today. So I want to start off with a question. One that I have asked myself many times in my life, and I have been asked many times as well. Didn't always have the best answer for it, but simply, why are there so many different denominations of Christianity? If we all read our Bible, for the most part the same, different translations sometimes, but we all read the Bible that for the most part is the same, how is it that we all come out on the other side believing something so drastically different? And literally have hundreds of different denominations of Christianity that, again, for the most part, believe somewhat of the same things, but sometimes not at all. Sometimes their belief and their faith and what they understand from Scripture is drastically different from others. And I've always wondered that if we're all reading the same Scripture. I think the short answer is we just interpret it differently. You take a group of 10 people and they all read the same passage of Scripture, the same chapter, and there's a chance that some of them will see it differently on the other side. We interpret Scripture through different lenses, and we come out on the other side with a different understanding of what that passage means and what it says. So I want to just very quickly break down this idea of biblical interpretation today. So there are two principles of interpretation that we all use. And I've got two fun vocabulary words for you. Maybe you've heard them before, maybe you haven't. But regardless of whether or not you've ever heard of these ideas of interpretation, we all use one or the other. The first principle is called exegesis. This is simply when you read Scripture and you're trying to draw out the original intent of the author. You're using tools like literary and historical context to better understand, why did the author say this? Why are they targeting this certain subject? Why are they elaborating on this? You truly just want to better understand, why is this written this way? Why was this said at this time? The second principle is called eisegesis, which is quite the opposite of our first definition. Eisegesis is when you read and attempt to interpret Scripture based on personal presuppositions, personal agendas, and bias. This is when we approach Scripture and we try to make it say something that it doesn't. This is when I'm trying to twist and manipulate Scripture to say what I want it to say, to give me the answers that I'm looking for in my life. So really, to break these two ideas down, exegesis versus eisegesis, it's really just reading to discover the true meaning of Scripture, again based on literary and historical context, versus manipulating Scripture to say what you want it to say, to answer your questions in a way that's convenient for your life. Oftentimes when I think of eisegesis, this second definition of interpreting Scripture, I think of the term cherry-picking Scripture. Maybe you've heard someone say that before. When I think of the term, it's when someone just snatches a Scripture right out of its historical and literary context, and they just want it to say something that's convenient for their life in that moment. They completely ignore the original intent of that passage. They misconstrue it, they manipulate it, they pervert it, and they make it all about them. In my experience, cherry-picking Scripture just completely strips it of all of its power. It's devoid of any of its power when you take a passage out of context. I think it goes without saying that we all intend to use exegesis when we're reading Scripture, that we want to truly pursue the author's original intent for a passage. But I think oftentimes it's easy to find ourselves on the other side of the fence and manipulating Scripture to say what we want it to say. Something that I'm particularly guilty of, and it's a great example of slipping over into eisegesis, is when we approach a passage of Scripture that maybe we've read, we can't even count how many times we've read it, and we go into it with this idea of, I'm going to discover something no one else has ever seen before. I want to read this and find new meaning that no one's ever seen before. And maybe that sounds romantic and it sounds spiritual and it sounds like you've got the right heart. You want to discover a part of God that maybe you haven't seen before. But when you strip that all away, really it comes down to pride. I want to read scripture and I want to find something no one else has ever seen before. I want to have this interpretation that no one's ever considered. And really, more often than not, when we read scripture, the plain meaning is there. We read something and oftentimes it means what it says. And we have this almost prideful desire to seek out more and to find new meaning behind scripture and just wow all of our Christian friends with, well, I read this and this is how I see it, and this new interpretation of this passage that's been around for thousands of years. And I used to read like that. I wanted to find something that no one had ever seen before. And eventually I came to the conclusion that I don't know that that's possible. And if I am finding something that no one has ever seen before, I'm probably making it up. I'm probably interpreting that scripture through my own bias, for my own agenda. In this case, the agenda is pride. I want to sound smart and I want to seem super spiritual because I see something that nobody else sees. And that's eisegesis. That's reading scripture to manipulate it for our own personal gain. So again, I think it goes without saying that we want to have good interpretation. We want to pursue the original intent. But many times, regardless of what our motives are, we can still find ourselves on the other side of the spectrum. Many times when I'm trying to study or read scripture, and I want to make sure I stay in this vein of exegesis, that I'm pursuing the original intent of this text, the original intent of the author, I kind of surround myself with 4 ideas to keep me on track. 4 reasons that I think it's crucially important that we know how to interpret scripture. Firstly, when we interpret scripture properly, it helps us better understand the characteristics of God. It helps us discover who He is. Secondly, if we discover who He is, we can better understand and discover our relationship with Him. As we discover our relationship with God, thirdly, we discover our relationship with the people around us. And fourthly, as we discover the relationship with people around us, we discover what's our relationship with the world. And I think if we can keep those 4 ideas in mind, it'll always keep you on track to pursue, again, the original intent of the scripture, to use tools like literary and historical context and not cherry pick scriptures and make them say what you want to say, and so you can post them on your bathroom wall and not truly understand what that scripture meant for the original audience when it was written. I think that's the real power behind scripture. When we understand what was going on in the world when this passage was written, what was the author trying to communicate? Why was he focusing in on this subject so much? What was considered normal and taboo at the time that this passage was written? And then when we start to take these things into consideration when we're reading scripture, the weight of it is so much heavier. It's so much more real, all because we're just considering, again, the author's original intent of the passage. I'm so excited to kick off this series with you guys. I really wanted to lay a good solid foundation for this series so that we have some ideas of, okay, now I can just ask myself, how do I interpret scripture? Do I find myself honestly pursuing the original intent of this text, or do I manipulate it? Do I look for something that's not there? Do I try to read between the lines and discover something no one's ever seen before? I want you to ask yourself that question and let it really permeate. Let it sit on your heart for a while and really go dig deep into yourself when you ask this question, because it's important. Everything in this life hinges on understanding that book, on understanding the biblical text. If you want to efficiently share the gospel with people, we need to understand the text. If you want to better understand your relationships with people, with God, with this world, we have to understand the biblical text. It's so very important. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I am pumped for this series. It's going to be great, and I look forward to the next one.